Fraud is no longer just a risk for auto dealers, it has become part of everyday operations. Experian Automotive's Fraud Protect solution helps you catch income, identity, and trade-in fraud in real time without slowing down the sale. Stop fraud. Keep deals moving. Experian Automotive's Fraud Protect.
Welcome to Daily Drive for Thursday, August 27th, 2026. I'm Kellen Walker in Las Vegas. Today on the show, President Trump is doubling down on 50% tariffs on Canada. China is ordering a recall of more than 4 million EVs over a hidden design flaw. And a longtime Ford executive is calling it a career. Plus, Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, talks about what the trade war is actually costing the industry and why the escalation is causing permanent damage to North American trade.
It hasn't worked because Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and the famous American checks and balances we all learned about in school are failing.
Let's run through all the news you need to know to keep up in the auto industry. President Trump is escalating the U.S.-Canada trade war, doubling down on his justification for 50% tariffs on Canadian goods. Trump made the comments during a Wednesday interview with conservative talk show host Glenn Beck.
They don't have anything that we have to have. Okay, we can get by. I mean, there are a couple of things that would make it a little inconvenient, but we could get them elsewhere. And it's time to teach Canada you can't do this anymore.
Senior counselor Peter Navarro piled on, calling Prime Minister Mark Carney the worst thing that ever happened to Canada. China is ordering a sweeping EV recall over a hidden door handle design flaw. Tesla alone needs to recall almost 3 million vehicles. 8 Chinese automakers, including Geely, Xiaomi, and Xpeng, will have to recall another 1.3 million, pushing the total past 4 million EVs. China's State Administration of Market Regulation says emergency mechanical door releases blend into vehicle interiors, making them nearly impossible to find after a crash. Tesla's fix: warning labels and an over-the-air software update starting September 25th. And Ford's Lisa Drake is retiring at the end of the year. Drake is a 32-year Ford veteran who built the automaker's Ford Energy division from the ground up. Dave Carroll, former CEO of ENGIE North America, takes over as president of Ford Energy on August 31st. Drake will stay on through December for a structured transition. Ford CEO Jim Farley said Carroll brings a rare buy-side perspective on what utilities need. Joining me now is John Hutter, who covers finance and insurance for us at Automotive News. He and Paige Hodder are out today with a story about how remote finance managers are gaining traction at some of the country's biggest dealership groups and what it means for the F&I office. John, welcome back to Daily Drive.
Hey, good to be here.
All right, John. So what is this trend and why are more dealership groups doing this?
Well, yeah, the concept is called, remote F&I or virtual F&I. And the idea is you have, rather than having your customers wait for a while for the finance office, if it's backed up, because that can be a significant bottleneck in a dealership, you have them do a video call with a remote F&I manager. And this can solve a couple of different problems. One is just the wait itself. And two is just a staffing problem. Like if you've got enough volume to that would be about 1.5 people worth of work, so you can't hire that second person, but you've got that other to cover. You can kind of outsource it to the remote F&I person. So yes, there's it's very, very helpful. Yeah. Group One and Lithia both said that they were using it. Group One is in, I believe like at least more than 60 stores, and both were kind of pleased with the results. So the fact that 2 of the nation's largest dealership groups have adopted it, besides the growth that we've already heard from the JM&A Group, for example, is a provider of that service. They've described just growth in the dealerships in general. Assurance started doing it; they've seen growth this year. So it definitely sounds like it's going to be a trend to watch for dealerships.
So, as you said, Group One and Lithia are both praising the results, but some of their biggest rivals are sitting this one out. What's the hesitation there?
Yeah, it was interesting. The 2 that talked to us, AutoNation just said they were happy with their current F&I model. Sonic actually brought it up on the call itself. Their president Jeff Dyke said they'd let Group One lead the charge. And his line was, "We do such a good job in F&I that they don't need a wobble," was how he put it in there. And I think what the concern is that by switching to a remote manager versus an in-person one, your F&I gross profit will drop down. Your penetration, the amount of products you sell customers, and that was one of the things that we spoke with Assurant, who's been developing a program and has started it this year. And that's one of their key things they kind of pride themselves on, that their remote managers they're providing dealerships are delivering as good as or better results than the in-person ones. Because no dealership wants to adopt this thing, pay to adopt it, and then all of a sudden all their profit goes down. So I would imagine that's the concern among some of the larger players at this point, in terms of adopting it.
Perfect. John Hutter, good stuff. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
You can find all of John's reporting on remote F&I at autonews.com. Coming up, APMA's Flavio Volpe talks about why the North American auto industry can't afford President Trump's trade war against Canada. That's next on Daily Drive.
Fraud is no longer just a risk for auto dealers. It has become part of everyday operations. According to Experian Automotive, nearly 9 out of 10 dealers say fraud is a top concern, and 70% say it's on the rise. We're talking about real deals slipping through, costing dealerships $10,000, even $20,000 per incident. And it's not just one type of fraud. You've got forged income documents, fabricated salaries, synthetic identities, even trade-in scams. The worst part? Catching fraud often slows everything down, adding friction to deals and frustrating legitimate customers. That's where Experian Automotive's Fraud Protect solution comes in. It's designed specifically for dealers, helping you quickly detect income, identity, and trade-in ownership before it hits your bottom line. No guesswork, no unnecessary delays, just faster, more consistent verification so you can protect your profits while keeping the buying experience smooth. Because the goal isn't just to stop fraud, it's to keep good deals moving. Experian Automotive's Fraud Protect. No more. Risk less. Sell smarter.
Welcome back to Daily Drive. I'm Kellen Walker. Since trade talks between the U.S. and Canada broke down last week, the situation has only gotten louder. Flavio Volpe is president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, which represents auto suppliers in Canada. He joins Greg Layson of our sibling publication, Automotive News Canada, to talk about how the industry has absorbed 25% tariffs so far, the permanent structural damage that's already underway, and what a jump to 50% would actually mean for the supply chain. This is an excerpt of this week's Automotive News Canada podcast. You can hear the full conversation on the latest episode of the Automotive News Canada podcast, available Friday morning.
Flavio, thanks for joining me on the podcast this week.
Always a pleasure, Greg.
Yeah, great to have you here. Look, let's start here. We've been living with 25% tariffs, but as everyone knows, USMCA compliant standalone parts are exempt, and only the non-compliant portions of a vehicle, a finished vehicle, are tariffed. How has the auto industry dealt with that so far?
Well, let me say we've been living with a contested national security tariff on cars, with an exemption on parts, an exemption on U.S. content in those cars, and a very generous definition by Commerce, the Department of Commerce, on what U.S. content is. That notwithstanding, the effective tariff is probably somewhere between 1.5 and 2 times the profit margin on a healthy year for those car companies. And the result is we're down about 25% to 30% in production in Canada on vehicles that you and I both know are essentially destined for a U.S. customer. And for people who don't know as they're listening to this, Canada-U.S. is one market. Never mind that we assemble stuff together. It's one market. So hindsight is not 20/20 on this. We've built everything together. It's like one kitchen in a restaurant. And the owner of the restaurant said, okay, some of the chefs and some of the wait staff and some of the guys who got to wash dishes and some of the people that go to the food terminal in the morning, you got to work for free if you want to be here. Well, you're just ruining the restaurant.
I want to know though. So we've lived with these tariffs, and yet vehicle pricing has stayed essentially the same. And we know that General Motors, for example, makes heavy duty trucks in Canada. They're sold in both countries, as you mentioned, but they're the only vehicle that GM makes in Canada that's taxed or tariffed. And then that tariff is spread out over all of the vehicles. Has some of that been happening, and have the automakers been able to mitigate that? And what does that do for your members and your suppliers?
Let's go back to that first point I made. We're living under a contested tariff. And the way that the automakers are dealing with this contested tariff is to consider it a temporary cost to spread on where they can around the dealer lots and around their product, or absorb it. And those companies, Ford wrote off $25 billion last year. They say on EVs and tariffs, and that EV is the biggest piece, but it's the same administration who stranded a bunch of new capital investment while then tariffing existing operating capital and manufacture of goods. General Motors was $6 billion, Stellantis was $25 billion. As long as this thing was temporary and shortish term, you can deal with it that way. The markets view every single Western automaker the same way in that sense. And so you may suffer, but you'll suffer in a relative sense at the same level as your competitor. For auto parts suppliers, when your customer is capital constrained and burning money to keep the heat on, they're not interested in your arguments about what your product can do for competitiveness or your productivity or the long-term relationship that you've had. They're concerned with not burning more money tomorrow because they don't know whether that contested tariff is a permanent structural cost they have to build in. When they go to Canadian suppliers for new programs, they are saying, give me your U.S. option. I like you. You're a good supplier. We've worked well together. Business is business. Show me your U.S. option. And so we're seeing that other bleed, this uncertainty on this temporary tariff is causing permanent structural damage for the footprint here.
So let's move to a 50% tariff. Let's threat we heard this week from President Donald Trump on January 1st, 50%. What would that do to the industry? What would change? Would we see something materially change? Would we see production, whether it's parts or autos, move to the United States, which is his stated?
Well, you and I have been having this conversation for a year and a half, and really goes back to an example that you and I talked about in 2022 when the Ambassador Bridge blockade caused for parts not to be able to cross the borders. 50, 500, 5,000%, it doesn't matter. If you tariff parts, unlike vehicles, that we've seen automakers willing to spread tariffed vehicles around their dealer inventory, 60, 70, 90-day delays, 120, a dozen products where two of them are costing way much more than their profit margins are. There's some mitigation strategies. On parts, the importer of record is the OE, and those parts, they do not build an inventory beyond 24 hours. So that tariff's got to get paid on day one. So just use Canada. You know, in the past, we've had this argument of parts from Canada and Mexico. $60 million of parts hit the border every day. That means in Donald Trump's world, $30 million of cost will hit on Monday. And 60 by Tuesday, 150 by the end of the week. Who's going to pay that? The broker? Who's going to pay that? The part supplier? Part supplier is working on a 7% margin. The only person who can pay that is the importer. And are the OEs going to rack up $600 million a month, $7.5 billion a year in tariffs on parts? Or are they going to put their tools down, say, hold on, what are we doing here? And it's going to shut the industry down, like the 2022 Ambassador Bridge blockade that took 3 days before it started shutting plants in Michigan and Ontario. And then by the fourth and fifth day, we had plants shutting down in Kentucky. I think I don't think it's an empty threat by the president. I just think that he has a really bad short-term memory, but he's likely been inundated this week from calls from Detroit and every other automaker operating a plant in the U.S. saying, Ashley, there is nothing you can do about that math. So you better back off that.
Look, you're close to the talks. You're close to the people who are at the table. You're close to people who are in contact with the United States. You're part of this. And you've often said that tariffs applied to vehicles built in Canada hurt U.S. automakers. That's because the Detroit 3 all manufactured here. If that's the case, why haven't we heard from U.S. automakers? Particularly, why haven't we heard them complain out loud? Or are they doing what you just suggested, calling the White House on a private line and bending the ear of Lutnick and Trump and others? What is going on there? Why has the Detroit 3 been so quiet if it has the potential to cost them, as you just suggested, $30 million a day?
Well, putting Jim Farley aside, CEO of Ford, who's been quite public and has probably been the most useful voice in all of this, in rational terms, explaining that putting a tariff on Canada and Mexico would blow a hole through the U.S. industry. I think Detroit has taken a position of let's do some quiet advocacy, strong. Like, I know what they're saying. They're being as strongly argumentative as you hope, but you're doing it quietly because none of us who has worked in any of the last 4 or 5 decades has ever had to run into Donald Trump, who negotiates like a mafia boss, who it isn't just untrustworthy and that you have to price it in that he may go back on the deal he made with you. It's that he is malignant with his trade policy and his tariff policy and his domestic tax policy and his enforcement policy and his tinkering with and interference with the DOJ and the IRS. You're running a car company. You have shareholders. You have institutional shareholders. You have a board. You have partners. You have a responsibility to a company that, in Detroit's case, are 120 years old. And they've made the decision to try things differently through Trump 2.0. Has it worked? No. But I'm not sure that doing it out loud would have had a different result. It hasn't worked because Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And the famous American checks and balances we all learned about in school are failing.
Flavio Volpe spoke with Greg Layson of our sibling publication, Automotive News Canada. You can hear their full conversation on this week's episode of the Automotive News Canada podcast, available Friday morning wherever you get your podcasts. That's Daily Drive for today. I'm Kellen Walker. Thanks to Automotive News executive producer Jake Neer, as well as our own John Hutter, Jan Gian, and Michael Martinez for their reporting for today's podcast. You can get the latest news on the U.S.-Canada trade war, EV recalls, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com. Come back tomorrow for a conversation with Teresa Bourdonnais of Informative about fraud in auto lending and how it's gotten harder for lenders and dealers to fight it.
There's lots of different types of fraud, and it takes more these days than a seasoned desking manager or F&I manager or director to spot these gaps for sure.
We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. And if you enjoyed the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.